A homeless man named Michael walked the streets of Los Angeles every day. His life had taken a difficult turn, leading him to a place of uncertainty and struggle. Michael had once been a regular guy with a stable job and a small apartment, but circumstances had spiraled out of control. Job loss, mounting debts, and the inability to keep up with rent had slowly pushed him to the streets. He lost contact with family and friends, and day by day, the world seemed to close in on him. Every day, Michael passed by the same luxurious mansion, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, grand pillars, and towering gates. It was the kind of home that looked as if it belonged to royalty. From the outside, he would occasionally catch glimpses of well-dressed people going about their lives. There were often luxury cars pulling in and out of the driveway, catering services coming in for large parties, and security guards making sure no one came too close. Michael had gotten used to seeing this life of luxury, far removed from the realities of his own world. But every day, he would stare for a few moments at the mansion, wondering what it would be like to live that kind of life. One chilly afternoon, as Michael made his usual way down the street, something strange caught his attention. A figure stepped out of the front door of the mansion, someone who seemed oddly familiar. Michael stopped dead in his tracks and squinted his eyes. The man standing on the grand porch was laughing, talking on his phone, and wearing an expensive-looking suit. Michael's heart began to race. That face, that voice, it couldn't be. He moved a little closer to the gate to get a better look. The man turned his head slightly, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. It was his brother, David. David had always been the ambitious one, the one who had left home early to pursue a career in finance. They hadn't spoken in years, not since their mother's funeral, when an argument had torn the two brothers apart. David had gone on to achieve incredible success, working for one of the biggest investment firms in the country, while Michael's life had gone in the opposite direction. Seeing David now, in this extravagant mansion, was like a slap to the face. How could it be that his own brother lived in such wealth and comfort, while Michael had been sleeping on park benches and scrounging for food? Michael felt a swirl of emotions: anger, shame, resentment. He quickly ducked behind a tree, not wanting David to see him. He stood there, wrestling with the idea of approaching his brother. What would he say? How could he even begin to explain how his life had fallen apart? And worse, would David even care? After all, years had passed, and David had never reached out. He had moved on with his life, while Michael had become a shadow, forgotten by the world. For the next several days, Michael avoided that street entirely. The sight of David had stirred up memories and emotions that he wasn't ready to confront. He began sleeping in a different part of the city, hoping to clear his mind. But the more he tried to forget, the more the thought of David haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to face his brother, if not for reconciliation, then at least for closure. Finally, after almost a week, Michael found himself walking back toward the mansion. This time, he was determined to go through with it. He would confront David, tell him everything, and let the chips fall where they may. As he approached the mansion once more, he saw that same familiar luxury: the expensive cars, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the fountains sparkling in the sunlight. But something was different today. The front gate was slightly ajar. Michael hesitated. Was this a sign? Taking a deep breath, he walked up to the gate and slipped through, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked down the long driveway, feeling out of place, as if every step was a trespass. He reached the front door and stood there for a moment, staring at the ornate knocker. This was it. There was no turning back now. He knocked. Once. Twice. There was a long silence, and then the door slowly opened. A woman in a formal black and white uniform appeared. It was the housekeeper. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in Michael's appearance, his ragged clothes, and unshaven face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. I'm here to see David," Michael said, his voice shaky but determined. The housekeeper hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here," she said, before disappearing inside. Michael stood there, feeling as though time had slowed to a crawl. Every second felt like an eternity. He glanced around the grand entrance, the marble floors, the chandeliers, the artwork on the walls. It was a world so far removed from his own that he could hardly believe his brother lived here. After what felt like hours, David appeared at the door. His expression was one of confusion at first, but then recognition slowly dawned on his face. He looked shocked, almost as if he couldn't believe who was standing in front of him. "Michael!" David's voice was full of disbelief. "Is that you?" Michael felt his throat tighten. He had imagined this moment in so many different ways, but now that it was happening, words seemed to fail him. "Yeah, it's me," he managed to say. "It's been a long time." David stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning his brother's face, taking in his disheveled appearance. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice soft but full of concern. Michael felt a wave of shame wash over him, but he forced himself to speak. "Life happened," he said with a bitter chuckle. "Things went south. I lost everything, David." David's face softened, and for a moment the tension between them seemed to melt away. "Why didn't you reach out to me? I could have helped you." Michael shrugged. "I didn't think you'd want to hear from me after everything. We didn't exactly part on good terms." David stepped closer, his expression full of regret. "Michael, you're my brother. That fight we had, that was years ago. I've thought about you so many times since then, wondering how you were. I never imagined. I didn't know you were out here, living like this." Michael looked down, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I didn't think you'd care. You've got this whole life now, this house, this success. I figured you'd forgotten all about me." David shook his head. "I never forgot about you. I didn't know how to reach out. I thought you didn't want anything to do with me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of all the years of silence, of anger, of misunderstandings, hung heavy in the air between them. But then, something shifted. David took a deep breath and placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Come inside," David said softly. "Let's talk. Let's figure this out." Michael hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded. Together, the two brothers stepped inside the mansion, ready to confront their past and, perhaps, build a future together. It was the beginning of a long journey toward healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Michael knew that, for the first time in years, he wasn't walking it alone. As Michael stepped inside the mansion, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, and a sense of disbelief. It was hard for him to reconcile the life of luxury his brother now lived with his own harsh reality. The contrast was overwhelming. David led him through the grand entrance hall, with its polished marble floors and chandeliers that sparkled above them. Everywhere Michael looked, there were reminders of how far his life had fallen apart. They entered a spacious living room, decorated with modern art and expensive furniture, the kind Michael had only ever seen in magazines. He sank into one of the leather chairs, feeling out of place but too exhausted to care. David sat across from him, his eyes full of questions, but he didn't speak right away. After a moment of silence, David finally said, "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but I need to know, how did it get this bad? How long have you been out there, Michael?" Michael shifted in his seat, staring at his hands. It wasn't an easy story to tell. "It didn't happen all at once," he began, his voice low. "After Mom died, Things just started to go downhill. I was laid off from my job a few months later, and then I couldn't keep up with the rent. One thing led to another, and I ended up on the streets." David's face tightened with concern. "Why didn't you ask for help? You knew I would have done anything for you." Michael sighed heavily. "At first, I was ashamed. I thought I could fix things on my own, that it was just a rough patch. But then, the longer it went on, the harder it became to reach out. I didn't want to admit how bad things had gotten." David leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You didn't have to go through that alone, Michael. We may have had our differences, but you're still my brother. I would have helped you if I'd known." Michael felt a lump in his throat, a wave of regret washing over him. "I didn't think you'd want to help. We didn't leave things on the best terms after Mom's funeral. I thought you were done with me." David looked away for a moment, the pain of their last argument clearly still weighing on him. "I'm sorry for how things went back then. I was angry, and I let that anger get in the way of what was important. I should have reached out to you sooner. I should have tried to fix things between us." Michael nodded, the tension between them easing slightly. "I guess we both could have done things differently." David exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of pent-up guilt. "Well, we're here now. That's what matters. We can start over, Michael." For the first time in years, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. He had been so used to surviving day by day, scraping by, that the idea of starting over seemed foreign to him. But sitting here, in the warmth of his brother's home, the possibility of rebuilding his life didn't seem so impossible anymore. David stood up and walked toward the kitchen. "Let me get you something to eat. You must be starving." Michael hadn't realized just how hungry he was until David mentioned food. His stomach growled loudly, and he chuckled nervously. "Yeah, I could eat." As David prepared a meal, Michael sat back and let his mind wander. It was strange how quickly life could change. Just a week ago, he was walking the same streets, convinced that he had been forgotten by the world, abandoned by his family. Now, here he was, sitting in his brother's mansion, reconnecting after years of estrangement. David returned with 2 plates of food, steak, mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables. Michael's eyes widened at the sight. It had been so long since he'd had a proper meal like this. He dug in gratefully, savoring every bite. As they ate, the conversation between the brothers grew easier. They talked about the past, the years they had missed in each other's lives. David shared stories of his career and the challenges he had faced climbing the corporate ladder, and Michael told him about life on the streets, the hardships, and the small moments of kindness from strangers that had kept him going. David listened intently, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. "I can't imagine what you've been through," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Michael. I should have been there." Michael shook his head. "You couldn't have known. I didn't make it easy for anyone to find me." David put his fork down and looked at Michael seriously. "I don't want you to go back to that life. You don't have to live on the streets anymore. I can help you get back on your feet." Michael hesitated, unsure of what to say. It had been so long since he'd accepted help from anyone. The idea of relying on someone else felt foreign to him now. "I don't want to be a burden, David." "You're not a burden," David said firmly. "You're my brother. We're family. I want to help you." Michael felt his defenses slowly crumble. The years of pride and stubbornness that had kept him from reaching out to anyone began to melt away. He realized, in that moment, that he didn't have to do it all alone. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. "Okay," Michael said softly. "I'll accept your help." David smiled, relief flooding his face. We'll take it one step at a time. There's no rush, but we'll get you back on your feet. I'll make some calls, see if I can find a place for you to stay temporarily, and we'll figure things out from there." Michael nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you, David. I don't even know where to begin." "You don't have to say anything," David replied, his voice warm. "We'll do this together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt like he had a future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and difficult days. But he wouldn't be walking it alone. With David by his side, he knew he had a chance to rebuild his life. The two brothers sat there in the warmth of the mansion, talking long into the night. The years of separation and misunderstanding slowly faded away as they reconnected, not just as family, but as friends. As the night wore on, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The weight of his past was still there, but it didn't seem so heavy anymore. He had found his brother, and in doing so, he had found a part of himself that he thought had been lost forever. And for the first time in years, Michael believed that things could, and would, get better. As the night grew deeper, Michael and David found themselves sitting in the living room, the quiet hum of the mansion's ambience around them. They had been talking for hours, and although there were moments of awkwardness, the familiarity between them was slowly being restored. For Michael, it felt surreal to be sitting there, in a home so different from the life he had been living. He had spent years isolated from the world, assuming no one cared. But here he was, reconnecting with his brother. David had already started laying out a plan for Michael. "I know someone who runs a program for people trying to get back on their feet," David said, leaning forward in his chair. "It's not just about finding housing or a job. They focus on rebuilding lives, mental health support, job training, the whole thing. I think it could be a good start for you." Michael listened, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. "I've been on my own for so long, David. I don't know if I can just fit back into normal life again." David leaned back, nodding as he understood the weight of Michael's hesitation. "You don't have to rush into anything. But you can't keep living on the streets. I'll be here every step of the way, okay? You're not alone in this." Michael's gaze dropped to the floor. A part of him wanted to jump at the opportunity, to grab onto this lifeline that David was offering. But another part of him, the part that had been hardened by years of isolation and struggle, was scared. Scared of trusting someone again. Scared of failing. Scared of letting his brother down. "I'll think about it," Michael said finally, his voice quiet. David nodded again, not pushing the issue. "Take your time. Just know that whatever you decide, I've got your back." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. Michael couldn't remember the last time he had felt safe. Truly safe. And even though there was still a lot to figure out, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was facing it all alone. After a while, David stood up. "Let me show you to the guest room," he said. "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we can figure out the next steps." Michael followed his brother through the mansion's long, dimly lit corridors. The house was massive, and it still amazed him how much his brother had achieved in the years they had been apart. David opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing a spacious guest room. The bed was large, covered in soft linens, and there was a private bathroom attached. It was the kind of room Michael had only seen in expensive hotels when he still had a home and a job. "This is too much," Michael said, standing awkwardly at the door. "It's just a room, Michael," David said, smiling softly. "You deserve to be comfortable." Michael hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The warmth of the room and the comfort it offered felt overwhelming. He hadn't slept in a real bed in so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "Thanks, David," Michael said quietly. David nodded. Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow. With that, David left, closing the door behind him, leaving Michael alone in the room. Michael stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The luxury, the comfort, it felt foreign, almost unreal. Slowly, he sat down on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the soft blanket. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The events of the day, seeing David again after so many years, and the weight of the decisions ahead were all swirling in his mind. He lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. It was strange to be in a place where he didn't have to worry about where he'd sleep or what he'd eat tomorrow. 4 years, every day had been a struggle for survival. He had grown used to the discomfort, to the uncertainty. Now, he was in a place of safety, and yet, it felt almost too good to be true. As he lay there, Michael thought about everything David had said. About the program, about getting back on his feet. Could he really do it? Could he find his way back to a normal life after everything that had happened? He closed his eyes, feeling the soft bed beneath him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. Maybe he didn't have to walk this road alone anymore. The next morning, Michael woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling the room with warmth. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. But as he sat up in the bed, the events of the previous day came flooding back. He was in his brother's house, a place he never thought he would be again. Michael took a deep breath and got out of bed, walking over to the window. The view was breathtaking. The backyard stretched out into a perfectly manicured garden, with a pool glistening in the morning sun. Beyond that, there were trees and rolling hills. It was a stark contrast to the streets he had grown used to, with their cold concrete and noisy traffic. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Michael called. The door opened, and David stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning," David said, offering one to Michael. "How'd you sleep?" Michael took the coffee, grateful for the warmth in his hands. "Better than I have in a long time." David smiled. "Good to hear. I know there's a lot to think about, but we can take things slow. No pressure." Michael nodded, sipping his coffee. "I appreciate that." They spent the morning talking about the program David had mentioned the night before. It was a rehabilitation and reintegration center for people who had fallen on hard times. People like Michael. They helped with everything from housing to job placement, but what appealed to Michael the most was the counseling and emotional support. He had been carrying so much for so long that the idea of having someone to talk to, someone who could help him process everything, felt like a lifeline. "I'll go," Michael said finally, after hours of conversation. "I'll try the program." David's face lit up with relief. "I think it's a good step, Michael. And remember, you're not doing this alone. I'll be here, helping you however I can." Michael felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. But for the first time in a long time, he had a plan, a direction. And most importantly, he had his brother by his side. As the days passed, Michael began the slow process of rebuilding his life. He moved into temporary housing through the program, met with counselors, and started attending job training workshops. There were hard days, days when he doubted himself, when the weight of his past mistakes felt overwhelming. But each time he stumbled, David was there, offering encouragement, reminding him that he wasn't defined by his past. Weeks turned into months, and gradually, Michael began to find his footing. He secured a part-time job, and for the first time in years, he had a place to call home. It wasn't much, just a small apartment, but it was his. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, of the life he was slowly reclaiming. Through it all, Michael and David grew closer. The distance that had once separated them seemed to vanish, replaced by a bond stronger than ever before. They spent weekends together, sometimes at David's mansion, sometimes at Michael's modest apartment. They talked about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. And though the road had been long and difficult, Michael had finally found his way back, not just to his brother, but to himself. As months turned into a year, Michael stood in front of the small window of his apartment, looking out at the quiet street below. The apartment was modest, but it was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of how far he had come. There were days when he still struggled, days when the memories of the streets would creep in, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Now, more than ever, he felt like a man who had reclaimed his life. David had been true to his word. The bond between the two brothers had strengthened in ways Michael could never have imagined. What had once been a relationship fractured by misunderstandings and distance had been healed through forgiveness, patience, and love. David visited often, and the two shared many moments of quiet reflection and laughter, two things that Michael had almost forgotten existed in his life. They spoke of the future with hope, something Michael had once thought impossible. One warm afternoon, as the sun cast golden light across the city, Michael sat on the porch of his apartment, a cup of coffee in his hands. He was waiting for David, who had promised to take him out for a drive to the coast, a tradition they had started once Michael got back on his feet. As he sipped the coffee, Michael smiled to himself, thinking of the journey he had been on. The man who had once walked aimlessly past the mansions of the rich, hopeless and lost, was no longer a shadow of who he used to be. He had learned that life wasn't about the wealth of things, but the wealth of relationships, of second chances, of the people who stood by you when everything else fell apart. And for Michael, his brother had been that unwavering presence, guiding him back when he thought there was no way forward. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was David, as punctual as ever, smiling that familiar smile that always reassured Michael he wasn't alone. "Ready to go?" David asked, his eyes bright with excitement. Michael nodded, standing up and grabbing his jacket. As they walked toward David's car, Michael felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, as life always is, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He had faced his demons, embraced his struggles, and through it all, he had found hope. Sitting in the passenger seat, Michael looked out at the city passing by, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. He turned to David, who was humming softly to the radio, and felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, David," Michael said quietly, his voice full of emotion. David glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," Michael replied. "For helping me see that I had a future." David smiled, his eyes softening. "I never would have given up on you, Michael. You're my brother." Michael nodded, his heart full. The words hung in the air between them, a quiet reminder of the love that had endured through all the trials they had faced. As the car sped down the highway toward the coast, the wind whipping through the open windows, Michael closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. For the first time in years, he felt free. Not just from the burdens of his past, but free to embrace whatever the future held. And for the first time in his life, Michael understood the power of second chances. How, even in the darkest moments, there was always hope, always a chance to rebuild. The ocean came into view, its vastness stretching out toward the horizon. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the waves. Michael smiled, letting the beauty of the moment sink in. This was his new beginning. As they parked near the beach and stepped onto the sand, David patted Michael on the back. They stood together, two brothers who had been lost but found their way back to each other. And as the sun set on that perfect evening, Michael knew, deep in his heart, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. His journey wasn't over, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had his brother by his side, a future ahead of him, and most importantly, he had hope. And that, he knew, was enough. With that, the story of Michael and David came full circle, a tale of healing, reconciliation, and the power of family. No matter how far one may fall, with love, forgiveness, and hope, there is always a path to redemption.